Chapter 7 Death or Submission. As we moved swiftly through the sky, my mind was focused on the task that lay ahead. Do we fight and die, or do we surrender and watch our freedom die? It seemed like a lose-lose situation, but I had to make a choice. Before long, we were flying on friendly breezes again, as Griffin spoke up. "If I may ask, sir, what's coming from this meeting?" "Bad things, Griffin, bad things," I replied. As we flew over an outpost, I added, "I need to call the soldiers to assembly." Without saying a word, Griffin lifted his head and let out a roar that got the attention of everyone he passed below. Passing too fast to see for sure, I assumed the men would be heading in the direction of the castle. After a few more cries to the people of the kingdom, Griffin landed softly in the courtyard. When his wings calmed, finding the resting place on his back, I dismounted and was swarmed by the March Hare and the Tweedles. As I began to stride toward the armory, the Tweedle spoke first. "Good to see you still have your head, Alan," Dum said as Dee finished. "What's all that screeching about?" "I'm calling an assembly," I answered. "Assembly?" March Hare exclaimed. "I love assemblies. I especially love assembling the assembly." "Hush, Hare," I scolded. "Where is Hatter?" With a slight chuckle, March Hare replied, while looking down at his arm as if wearing a watch. "Well, it just so happens to be tea time, so naturally he must be drinking tea." "In the throne room," the twins added in unison. After walking through the armory and down the hallway, we did indeed find Hatter in the throne room. Seated on the throne, he held the cup of tea in his left hand, and my sheathed vorpal blade was leaning to the right side of him. He appeared to be daydreaming because when we entered the room, he was startled by our presence. Throwing his cup of tea over his shoulder and leaping from the throne, he called out in a happy yet surprised tone, "Oh, you've returned. Don't mind me. I'm just having a think." I smiled in reply. "I think you mean thought, Hatter." He fired back, "Yes, well, depends how you look at it." He stepped closer to us. "Now then, you have news, and from all the noise, I'm assuming not good." I let out a sigh of despair. "You were right, Hatter. They want war." Hatter playfully boasted, "Well, of course I was right. I'm only as mad as I look." I trudged sorrowfully to the throne, and taking Hatter's place, plopped down and put my head in my hands, muttering, "What am I to do?" Taking note of my discouragement, Hatter, who was now standing with the rest of the group, stepped in front of me, and after removing his hat from his head, spoke softly, yet sternly. "Look at where you sit, Alan. You are on the throne in the Queen's absence, and in times like these, we look to the throne for answers. She entrusted you to make the right decision for us all, and you know what that is." He then gently grabbed the vorpal blade and held it out in front of me. "Lead us without fear, and we will follow to whatever end awaits." I looked up at him, and after a short period of reflection, took the blade from his hands. Pleased with this, Hatter flashed a grin and spun around, placing his hat back on his head. Moments later, the faint rattle of marching feet could be heard approaching the castle. It got louder and louder, and before long, the room was filled with chess-piece knights in gleaming armor. They all stood at attention in a row, with Hatter and the rest of my friends near the front. Seeing that the crowd now patiently waited for me to begin, I quickly tied the vorpal blade around my waist, took a deep breath, and whispered to myself, "Without fear." Then I rose to my feet and addressed the room with as much conviction as I could muster. "I have just returned from an audience with the Black Royalty. where we discussed matters of diplomacy between our kingdoms. They described the recent attack that has befallen you, your comrades, and your queen as a necessary punishment for White and the rest of Wonderland's royal family. The room stood silent as I began to pace. Any and all assumptions as for the reason for this attack are probably correct. They do intend to siege the throne of Wonderland from White, raze it to the ground, and inevitably erase the kingdom as it stands from existence so that they may rebuild it in their own proper image, and they will do so by any means necessary. You should know that the reason I was asked to attend this meeting was to be persuaded to convince you, the people of Wonderland, to comply and submit to their wishes. Unsettled mutters went around the room as I continued. You should also know that I have met with our queen. She is aware of the seemingly insurmountable odds we face with coming darkness, but ultimately her wish is that we fight, if not for her, then for yourselves, for the ones who lay around you, and for your land. I paused and looked out amongst the men as I took a deep breath and went on. What I'm about to ask you may seem cruel and unfair, but know that it's not easy. How could I ask you men to willingly face a certain demise such as this? The truth is, I wouldn't ask anything of you that I wouldn't ask of myself. I believe in you, I trust in you, and I say, if these are to be Wonderland's last days, why live in fear? In whatever life rises from our ashes, let them speak of the last Queen of Wonderland and the brave men who fought as heroes and not cowards. This is the time you make your legacy. I too will have one when this is over, as the last of a name that has become legend. I suddenly tore the vorpal blade out of its sheath and thrusted it high above me, saying, So, brothers in arms, last of your kind, will you fight with me once more in defense of all that you believe in as we become the legends we were destined to be? Upon my final words, the room fell quiet, as the gravity of the speech weighed on the shoulders of my audience. From out of nowhere, a voice from the back of the room exclaimed, Last Knights of Wonderland. This made all the chess pieces erupt in chants of excitement as they clanged their armor together in rhythm. After a few moments of this, the soldiers dismissed themselves as they emptied out of the throne room. As the noise began to fade, I sank back into the throne, surprised at my success in rallying the army. Just as I began to relax, the voice that started the morale came forward. It was the mounted knight that led us across the desert the day we came to the castle. He walked his horse forward and said with a bow, You spoke well, my lord. With a smile of greeting I replied, Thank you, but there is no need to bow. The knight swiftly replied, With all due respect, sire, there is every need to bow. I nodded my head in agreement, not willing to argue, as he asked, What are your orders? Trying to come up with an answer, I looked off to the side of the room where I saw Hatter standing straight and tall, while the twins were standing on both sides of the March Hare, holding him back from his overwhelming excitement toward the knight's horse. Then it came to me and I answered, Remove the bodies. I want them buried on the grounds leading to the castle. Handle this with care, the way the queen would want. And the Jabberwockies? The knight inquired. Those stay, I said confidently. Let those be a symbol of our fearlessness. Very good, sir, he said as he dismissed himself and turned his horse to leave. Again I rose to my feet, putting my blade back on my hip. As I stood there watching the night disappear, Hatter's voice softly asked, "What would you have us do, my lord?" Walking toward the group, I replied, If I am to be a king of sorts, I'll need advisors. Advise me. I then strode into the dining hall as they followed close behind. Just before reaching the doors, Hatter asked, "What do you need to be advised on?" The speech. "No," I answered, pushing open the doors. "I believe I handled that as well as one could in my position." As the door swung open, we were immediately greeted by the Cheshire Cat, who was sprawled out on the table. "Right you are, Allan. Quite a rousing speech from our fearless leader. Bravo," he said, clapping his paws together. Startled, I took a step back, exclaiming, "Chesh! Well, since you've decided to join us, perhaps you can help as well." "Doubtful," Chesh said, rolling his eyes, as we all took our seats. I sat at the head, one Tweedle on each side of me. March Hare was aggressively placed in his chair to my left, and the Hatter sat at the foot, facing me. As we all got comfortable in our places and the Tweedles lit their pipes, I addressed the table. As I said to the soldiers, the Queen is aware that we are drastically unprepared for this war. It isn't likely we'll win as things stand, but she has a plan. I paused just long enough for Dee to react. "What's the plan?" he insisted. "On with it, boyo," Dum urged. "What do you know of Wonderhaven?" I asked in a slightly cautious tone. "Wonderhaven?" March Hare exclaimed, as he tugged nervously on his ears. "It's a myth," Dum interrupted. "It's a legend," the brothers said in unison. "One every Wonderlander knows," Hatter cut in. "But not a single Wonderlander can prove exists," March Hare muttered anxiously. "Why ask, Allan?" Hatter asked. "That's why I'm here," I replied. "The Queen thinks it's time to retrieve the weapon from within Wonderhaven." "The crystal rose," muttered everyone at the table indirectly. After shaking off the sudden trance, Chesh scolded, "How do we believe this is true?" "I have a key," I answered, holding up White's necklace for the table to see. "Wrong," Chesh fired back upon closer inspection. "You have a piece to the key that leads to the door, both of which no one here has ever seen." "But the Queen," I started to say. "Neglected to tell you where to find either," Chesh finished. Locked in a stalemate, Chesh and I glared at each other in silence. Just then, Hatter jumped up from his chair, saying, "Quite right you are, Cat, but I think I know someone who may be able to assist us with the whereabouts of our missing items." With that, he took off into the kitchen, and after a few moments of clanging dishes and slamming cupboards, he returned to his spot, holding a teapot in his hands. While he placed it on the table in front of us, I was the first to speak, doing so in a curious tone. "Hatter, I hardly think this is an appropriate time for tea, much less that it'll help." "It's not tea," March Hare responded in a chuckle. "It's the mouse," Chesh added, seemingly unamused. Hearing the cat but not fully understanding what he said, I turned my attention to Hatter's teapot, very intrigued with what may be inside. Hatter's movements were swift but gentle as he removed the lid and overturned the pot. What tumbled out was a curious little creature, a brown mouse wearing a maroon shirt and black vest. He had a patch of rather frazzled fur on the top of his head, and a black stripe over his right eye. As Hatter set the pot aside, the mouse laid motionless on the table, sleeping by the looks of things. A tiny black bowler hat rested not far from it. Looking down at the fragile mouse, Hatter said with a grin, "You might want to sit back a bit." He then began to poke the mouse with his finger, eventually rustling him awake. At first, he let out a series of bothered grunts, but after a few jostles, they became groggy words. "Not now, fellas," the mouse said, swatting at Hatter's finger with his eyes still closed. After some persistence from Hatter, the mouse added before rolling over, "Oh, all right, 2 lumps of sugar then, and some honey too." The poking kept on until the mouse was too disturbed to rest. Except when he was, his mood drastically changed. He went from his sleeping position on the table to his feet as he began spinning around and blindly swinging a small dagger and yelling, "If it's a fight you want, come and get me. I'll take you all on, let's have it. I'll cut you limb from limb." The mouse hostilely continued as he fully opened his eyes and realized who was in front of him. "Oi, Hatter, it's only you." He began staggering around as if drunk and hiccuping after every couple of words. "I could have had your digit, you know," he said with a drunken giggle. "Oh yes, and that would be unfortunate," Hatter replied with a happy expression. The mouse giggled and hiccuped as he put away his dagger and pulled out a pocket watch. "What'd you wake me up for anyways? It's not even tea time." Realizing it was upside down, he flipped it around. "At least I think it isn't." Hatter answered delicately, "It isn't, and my apologies, my little friend, but it seems we're in need of your services." Sure," the mouse replied with a hiccup. He stumbled backward and tripped over the lid of the teapot, landing on his back with his feet in the air, giggling at himself before turning his head toward the March Hare. "Hello there, Hare." He then casually turned his head to the Tweedles and let out a startled giggle with a hiccup soon after. "Crikey, thought I was seeing double." "Hello, Mouse," they said happily in unison. He lastly turned his attention to me, and with a hiccup asked, "Who's this, then?" I answered politely, "I'm Alan." The mouse sat right side up and collected himself, the patch of fur on his head scattered as if he stuck his tail in a light socket. "Hey, I've heard of an Alan. He's the bloke what defeated the Red Queen a while back. Gave her a right thrashing, he did," said the mouse, barely able to hold himself up. "He's over the bloody moon," Dee whispered to me. "But look at the company he keeps," Dum whispered back. With a grin, I responded to the mouse's statement. "That's right, and I'm him." The mouse wobbled back to his feet. "Now, that's quite a claim to be throwing around. What kind of fool would I be if I didn't ask for proof?" "A drunken one," answered Chesh, who stealthily had moved from the center of the table to the top of my seat behind my head. "Sod off, you filthy feline," the mouse barked. What big words from such a small rat." Finding humor in this banter, I responded with a chuckle. "That's enough, you two. Mr. Mouse, would this be sufficient proof?" I asked as I unsheathed the vorpal blade, just enough for him to see. "The vorpal blade," the mouse muttered to himself. "Well, I'll be a finger sandwich." He turned back to Hatter. "Why didn't you tell me? Where's my bloomin' hat?" Hatter quickly picked up the tiny hat, dusted it off, and placed it on the mouse's head. "Thanks, mate," the mouse whispered. He stumbled forward, appearing put together well enough for his liking, and cleared his throat before addressing me formally. "Pardon me, sir. I seem to have enjoyed a bit too much afternoon tea. The name is Dormouse. What could someone so insignificantly sized as myself do for you?" Truly impressed that he was able to go from such a mess to a respectable creature, I replied, "It's nice to meet you, Dormouse. The Legend of Wonderhaven. Do you know it?" "Aye, of course," answered the Dormouse. "Hatter tells us you might know where to find the pieces we need to get there. The key in the door." Dormouse replied with a nervous chuckle, "As flattering as all that is, I'm afraid I don't know exactly where they are. Only the Queen does," interrupted Chesh. "Right-o," said the Dormouse, "and she's very secretive about it too, as you might expect." "But does it exist?" I asked abruptly. "I'm sure it does, sir. Don't think the royal family would make this up. Sorry I can't be of any more assistance." After a momentary pause, I replied, "Oh, but you will be." I called Chesh down from his perch and spoke to them both. Finding the location of the key and the door is of the utmost importance. A mission that must be done quietly and under the noses of the troops. The two of you must find them and tell me of any progress immediately. "Why would I stoop to the level of working with a tipsy rodent?" Chesh asked in a snide tone. I responded sternly, "Because you two are the most unlikely to be suspected of looking, and if you wish to redeem yourself in the eyes of the Queen, you'll do as I ask." "If I may ask, sir, why the curiosity in secret doors?" asked Dormouse. "You may not," I answered. "Chesh will fill you in." "As you wish, sire," Chesh replied, seeming annoyed. "Good," I responded before turning my attention to the Dormouse. "Take the evening to sleep off your afternoon, and the two of you can begin your search tomorrow." "Aye, Captain," the Dormouse replied with enthusiasm. I then adjourned the meeting, and the group went their separate ways. Chapter 8. Fear by Night. The remainder of the day was routine. The kingdom was the busiest it had been since the attack. As the day slowly began to fade into night, it seemed the dread had begun to fade with it, and the castle was becoming recognizable again as it stood in the dark. While nearly every soul worked to bury the fallen and clean what remained, as I had commanded, I could sense our strength beginning to surface from hiding. As I walked through every hall of the castle, I observed the knights and the care in which they handled the dead. Everyone pitched in to honor the fallen with respect, but amongst the men, I noticed one face was missing. Hatter was nowhere to be found. Figuring it must be near tea time, I headed toward the courtyard, expecting I'd find him there. Walking through the armory and coming to the doorway of the courtyard, I did find him. He was standing alone on the balcony with the cup in his hands, as I predicted. He was eerily still as he gazed out over the charred rose garden and the great beasts that lay over it. As I walked up behind him, a true déjà vu moment hit me as I thought of the last time we sat together like this and discussed the meaning of the garden. Little did I know at the time, but this would prove to be perhaps the most unforgettable conversation I would have in Wonderland. Lovely evening, isn't it?" I said as I stopped just over his shoulder. Startled, Hatter jumped backward a step and responded, "Yes, quite." We then stood side by side in silence, trying to peer through the night. That was until Hatter interrupted it by removing his hat and taking another teacup off the top of his head. He offered it to me, asking, "Something weighing on your mind?" Taking only a second to process such a strange place to keep a teacup, I took it from him, and after a sigh and a sip, I replied, "We're not going to last long in this battle. Do you think I made the right decision?" With a soft chuckle, Hatter answered, "I hardly think it's my place to wonder whether the choice of the Queen and the Savior made is the right one. But if I had an opinion, I would say it's the only one. There is no doubt the attack caught us by surprise. It's not every day you see a Jabberwocky flying about. But the Queen has faith in you. And after your speech today, you've given us a reason to stand with you without question. You know what stands to be lost, Alan. If you call more knights, they will come. Although given our current odds, I don't think finding the crystal rose would hurt." With each gulp of tea, my questions got bolder. What is the crystal rose exactly? I mean, it is what it sounds like, but how is that a weapon? Hatter took a long breath and answered, "It is said that to the naked eye, it appears to be only a miraculous rose, but the true prize of it is the nectar. When consumed, it unlocks one's true potential, granting immeasurable power. Did the Red Queen know of this?" I inquired. "I imagine she did," Hatter replied. "It was probably the true reason behind her battles with White. If that nectar ever touched her lips, she would have had an unbreakable grasp on the throne. The problem was, every time she got close to the castle, a warrior was there to intercept her." "Alice," I muttered. Hearing me, Hatter continued, "And you, Alan. The Littles have proven to be the true guardians of Wonderland, and that rose." "And Wonderhaven. What do you know of that?" I asked. "No more than anyone else," Hatter said, while fidgeting with his cup. "I do know that it's a beautiful place, more so than any of this. A place bathed in a pure and undying light, where no evil can fester. But no living soul other than the royal family has seen it." "Do you believe in all of this, Hatter?" I asked cautiously. "Not just acknowledge it, but believe?" Hatter's tone turned serious. "I do. I suppose all Wonderlanders have to. We believe in Wonderhaven the same way you and Alice believe in Wonderland itself. Because nothing is impossible," I added. With a quick subject change, Hatter said, "Yes, well then, since you're so full of curiosity, allow me to ask you a question." I silently agreed with a sip of tea as he asked, "Where are Alice's journals, Alan?" This truly caught me off guard, and I began to panic on the inside. I couldn't tell him what actually happened to the journals. He wouldn't understand that I was placed in an asylum for my belief in Wonderland, or that my doctor disposed of them for my own good. Feeling trapped, I weaved the only story that made sense. I no longer felt I needed them. This land and its creatures are no longer foreign to me. As much as I appreciated Alice's guidance, I couldn't keep living in her path. So, I've made my own." A smile broke out on Hatter's face, and he raised his cup to cheers with me. After we touched cups, we sat in bliss for a few moments. This was disturbed soon after, however, by a blood-curdling screech stemming from the dark. A cold chill ran down my spine as I frantically tried to guess what it could be. But I got my answer when Hatter dropped his teacup and screamed, "Jabberwocky!" It all seemed to happen in slow motion. As the calm castle erupted into chaos, I pulled out the Vorpal blade as Hatter urged me toward the armory, while knights scattered into battle around us. I refused to budge, keeping an eye to the sky. All I could make out amidst the panic was a massive shadow that was scooping up men and launching them into the air as it passed. More and more men fell to this mysterious shape, as I just stood in awe at the horror unfolding around me. The only thing that broke my trance was Hatter, the Tweedles, and the March Hare dragging me to whatever shred of safety they could inch me to. Just as they did, the Jabberwocky drew back a breath and cast out a flame that divided the courtyard. Some men were swallowed up by the wall of fire as the sound of screams and the smell of burning flesh were all I could sense. With nowhere to go, we could only watch the flames dance to the rhythm of destruction, as the Jabberwocky's wings kept time and his screeches sang the melody. Refusing to run to another part of the castle, it occurred to me that this is what awaited in the days to come, but I chose to face it. Screams, fire, ash, it all stared me in the face, and for whatever reason, though I was hypnotized by it all, I still remained a pillar of courage. As the Jabberwocky circled back, it landed just shy of the balcony with the sound of thunder, and I laid my eyes on the beast for the first time. A frightening yet magnificent creature, it looked as though it had been the result of breeding between a griffin and a dragon. Black in color, its head, neck, upper legs, and parts of its long tail were covered in subtle teal and purple feathers, with scales covering its body everywhere underneath. Its great horns and the crest on its head glistened with purple, and its 6 eyes, 3 on each side, burned in blue. Upon landing, the Jabberwocky fiercely flapped its massive wings, swiping at knights and its talons, with its talons, and thrashing its whip-like tail. The troops soon gave up engaging the creature, as some more became victims. They stood back as far as they could, weapons still drawn, as the beast was ordered to calm by a gruff voice. The voice that gave the order I recognized as the King of Clubs. It took a moment for me to be sure, but when he dismounted the Jabberwocky's back, I was positive. The black royalty had arrived. Within seconds of the king's feet making contact with the floor, the men that were being held at bay by the Jabberwocky decided to challenge him. But before their swords could even touch the king, the queen, who was seated on the back of the beast, dropped them with only the raising of an eyebrow. The king nonchalantly strode over and past the dead bodies. And when he reached the flame wall, something curious happened. The section of flame in front of the king separated as if bowing, and he stepped through. Visibly unarmed, the king stood on our side of the chaos, and he began speaking. "Sorry to barge in like this," he said in sarcasm. "Why are you here?" I yelled from the middle of the group, gripping my sword tightly. As if hurt by my urgency, the king replied, "Such hostility. Well, if you must know, we need to talk. A bit of diplomacy, as you'd call it. You see, Alan, the Queen and I are very disappointed in you. You've abused our reliance on you to make the right choices. A bit uneasy now, I asked sternly, "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb with me, boy," the king quickly snapped before continuing. "My wife had a nice little conversation with your queen. Oh, but don't worry, she didn't sell you out completely. You see, the thing about our niece is that even though she may not look it, she's very prideful, fears nothing, and she made it very clear to us that she didn't wish to step down from the throne in peace. Naturally, it didn't take long for us to piece together your part in her plan." His tone turned frustrated, "Though I'm failing to see how you, the savior of Wonderland, could be so naive and frankly stupid." Just then, Hatter, who was at the front of the human wall protecting me, spoke up. "Oh, mighty King of Black, are you underestimating Wonderland's strength? Not a wise thing to be doing, even for royalty." Taken back by Hatter's outburst, the king took a few steps toward him and grinned. "Is that so? Look around you. Recall, if you will, the state in which I left your precious Wonderland on my last visit. Is this what you want?" He directed his words at me. He directed his words back to me. "You heard my warning. You know that I will not hesitate to push you past the point of recovery. That will be the reward for your bravery." After a few moments of silence, waiting for a reaction, the king added, "So it's Wortham. Very well. But if that's the way it shall be, let this be its declaration." Without warning, the king grabbed Hatter by the arms, and the two of them vanished from sight, teleporting to the other side of the firewall. Just as they reappeared, the king summoned a shadowy dagger from his sleeve and thrust it into Hatter's stomach. As Hatter began to gasp for air, the king whispered softly into his ear, "Bow to your true king." He then called out to the rest of us, "Pray, find peace in your lives, for come the day after tomorrow, they will end." He pulled the dagger out of Hatter and retreated back to the Jabberwocky. Hatter just stood motionless, looking down at his wound. It was difficult to get free of the twins and the March Hare. Their grip on me only grew tighter as I watched through the waving vision of the flames as Hatter fell to his knees in front of the beast. He threw his hat up high in the air with his last burst of energy and bowed his head. Before the hat touched the ground, the Jabberwocky lunged forward, crushing his lifeless body in its jaws. It threw its head back, and Hatter disappeared down its throat. With one final screech, it abruptly took off. My fighting became more desperate and violent now, as I began to wail cries of protest. The three remaining creatures forced me up against the external wall of the armory with such aggressiveness that my head bounced off of it, knocking me almost senseless. Before long, the embrace of unconsciousness had began to take hold. As the worried faces of my companions in the foreground began to blur, my eyes fixed on the background as the monster became a shadow once again, and the top hat fluttered to the ground. Before I blacked out, the last noise I heard was a very misplaced cawing. I managed to look up and see the outline of my raven guide perched above the doorway to the armory. Then the world went black. And that's where we're going to wrap this episode up, guys. I'm trying something a little bit different here. I think from this point on, it would be better to only do two chapters per episode. I think it'll be easier on everybody. This will, of course, make this series go a little bit longer, but I think the episodes will be a lot more easy to swallow for you guys. So we're gonna try it out and see how it feels, and you know, um, see, how or where we go from here. But until next time, guys, we'll see you in the next episode.